Before we dive into tonight's episode, we'd like you to pause for a second and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're tuning in from. Your city, your country, the time surrounding you at this very moment. We read each and every comment. We see you, from Lagos and London, Atlanta and Amsterdam, Kingston and Kuala Lumpur. Every time someone takes the time to leave a comment, it confirms that these silenced voices are finally finding an audience. If you haven't already subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please do so now. Be sure to turn on all notifications, because the account you're about to hear is the kind of history that never appeared in textbooks, was never part of any classroom discussion, and was never brought up in civil conversation. It was intentionally buried, wrapped in quiet, and sealed behind the walls of plantation houses, where powerful men believed their secrets would stay hidden forever. They were mistaken. The narrative we're sharing tonight isn't comfortable. It was never intended to be. It's a tale of what transpired when those carriages made their way down the long dirt paths of the American South, when the noise of horses and the laughter of men traveled to the ears of enslaved women laboring within those grand, terrifying homes. It's a narrative about what they understood, what they feared, what they withstood, and what they bore in silence for the remainder of their lives. Make yourself comfortable, remove any distractions, and pay close attention, because these women deserve, at the very least, to finally be listened to. There's a specific sound that surfaces repeatedly in the accounts of formerly enslaved women who served inside the Grand Plantation, homes of the American South. It isn't the overseer's whip cracking, though that noise appears often enough. It's not the rattle of chains or the auctioneer's voice calling out prices over the heads of people lined up in a courthouse yard. The noise that comes up most frequently, recalled with the most vivid detail, and described with the greatest emotional precision, is the sound of carriage wheels on a dirt road. The distant rumble, the rhythmic thud of wooden wheels on compacted earth, growing louder as the carriage drew closer, sometimes joined by the breathing of horses or the voices of men laughing at some private joke shared along the way. To the women who worked inside those houses, that sound wasn't just an announcement of guests. It was a warning. It signaled that the night ahead would be unlike others. It indicated that the delicate geography of threat those women maneuvered every day, every hour, had just taken a dangerous turn. It meant that unfamiliar men who held all the authority of a society designed to safeguard their pleasures and overlook their offenses, would soon be inside the same walls where those women toiled, ate, and tried to rest. It meant that by night's end, some of them would be ordered into spaces they desperately wished to avoid. And refusing was never an option in the world they inhabited. This is the story of those women, of what they faced inside the plantation homes of Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Arkansas, of the accounts they eventually gave when the bonds of slavery were broken, and they were finally, tentatively, free to speak, of what those accounts reveal about the nature of absolute power, the unique vulnerability of black women in the pre-Civil War South, and the deep moral collapse of a society that built its riches and its civility on the systematic desecration of human dignity. This is a story that history tried to erase. Tonight, on Shadows of Black History, we bring it back into the light, to grasp what took place within the plantation houses of the American South. You must first understand what those homes were intended to symbolize, and what they were designed to conceal. The grand plantation estates that dominated the southern landscape from the late 1600s through the Civil War were architectural declarations of dominance. They were constructed to be seen, Wide porches facing the road, tall columns rising to second-story balconies, symmetrical white, painted facades visible for miles across flat cotton fields and over rows of sugarcane and tobacco. From a distance, they broadcast everything their owners wished to convey: wealth, order, refinement, endurance. Travelers approaching these estates for the first time often spoke of a feeling of splendor. The long avenue of oak trees leading to the front entrance, the meticulously arranged formal gardens, the occasional sound of music drifting from parlor windows during the social season. If those visitors arrived by invitation, they'd be met at the door by a household servant, usually a woman, dressed in the tidy attire plantation owners required their domestic staff to wear as a mark of their own refinement. Everything visible was designed to reinforce a single story. This is a place of elegance. This is a place of culture. This is the highest form of Southern civilization. What that narrative required concealing was the world that made it possible. Behind the beautiful house sat the slave quarters, sometimes 100 yards away, sometimes within view of the kitchen windows. Low wooden structures with dirt floors and shared walls, housing dozens of human beings who had no legal rights, no freedom of movement, no legal protections, and no option to refuse when their owners will clashed with their own survival. The men and women in those quarters woke before dawn, worked until after dark, and returned to those structures utterly exhausted, night after night, season after season, year after year. But among all the enslaved individuals on a plantation, the women who worked inside the house held a position of unique and often misunderstood vulnerability. Historians and common narratives about slavery have sometimes suggested that house servants had it easier than field hands. They were shielded from the sun. They worked under a roof. They sometimes wore nicer clothes and ate more varied food. All of that was true, and almost entirely beside the point. What it obscured was the specific danger that being close to the plantation owner and his household created for enslaved women working inside those walls. Proximity meant visibility. Visibility meant selection. And selection in the antebellum South could mean many things, almost none of which favored the woman chosen. The women who cooked the elaborate dinners. The women who tidied guest rooms, turned down beds, and laid out fresh linens. The women who carried candles down dark hallways late at night. These women understood their world with a precision and clarity no official record of the era ever fully captured. They understood the gap between the plantation house as it appeared to visitors and the plantation house as it truly operated. And when those visitors arrived, they felt the difference in every fiber of their bodies. The world those women moved through was ruled by a legal and social structure, built with extraordinary care to protect the powerful and leave the powerless exposed. Under American slavery law, enslaved people were legally property, not persons. Property. The consequences of this classification were absolute. An enslaved woman had no legal right to refuse any command from her owner. She had no legal recourse against any kind of mistreatment. She couldn't file a complaint, seek legal action, testify in court against a white person, or appeal to any authority for protection. Her body, her labor, her time, and her very being were entirely at the discretion of the man who owned her. This wasn't a loophole or a flaw in the system. It was the system itself. And within that system, the arrival of guests at the plantation house carried implications every enslaved woman inside those walls understood with absolute clarity. Among the voices that survived the deliberate forgetting of the antebellum era, one stands above the rest in its clarity, its bravery, and its refusal to allow polite society to deny what happened inside those plantation homes. Her name was Harriet Jacobs. She was born in 1813 in Edenton, North Carolina, into a world that had already decided her worth in the most reductive terms imaginable. She was property. She was, in the language of the time, a slave girl. What Harriet Jacobs became, through years of suffering, defiance, and remarkable intellectual bravery, was something the world around her never intended. She became a witness. She became a writer. And through her 1861 autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she became one of the most crucial voices in American literary history. Not just because of her writing style, though that was extraordinary, but because of what she was willing to say. She was willing to speak what others wanted her to suppress. She was ready to describe, in language she knew would shock and disturb the primarily white, northern, middle-class women she wrote for, the particular sexual threats enslaved women encountered within plantation homes. She was willing to name, with a clarity that left no comfortable vagueness, the connection between the institution of slavery and the routine exploitation of enslaved women's bodies as a standard feature. Not an exception of plantation life, Jacobs detailed her own situation starting when she was about 15. Her enslaver, whom she called Dr. Flint in her narrative to shield herself legally, began a campaign of harassment, manipulation, and coercion that would stretch on for years. He whispered to her in the kitchen. He left notes. He spoke to her when no one else could hear. He didn't immediately resort to direct violence, because total power doesn't always require direct violence. It can operate through the constant threat of force, through the manipulation of every relationship a person cherishes, through leveraging the enslaved person's love for their children, their family, their small community to enforce compliance. But what Jacobs described in her narrative went far beyond her own experience. She documented the architecture of danger all enslaved women in domestic service navigated. She recounted the moment visitors arrived at the plantation house and the shift that came over the enslaved women working there, the careful awareness of which woman might be selected, the orders given after dinner, when the guests were settled and the candles burned low, the young women who walked toward the guest rooms and returned hours later silent. She wrote about how the plantation mistress reacted to these events, the jealousy, the cruelty, the punishment of enslaved women for their own victimization, the mistress who knew what her husband was doing and turned her anger not on him, whom she couldn't control, but on the enslaved women, whom she could. This dynamic, Jacobs wrote, was one of the most sinister aspects of slavery's corruption of the white household. The system created the crime and then redirected the response onto its most defenseless victims. Jacobs eventually chose a strategy of resistance so bold and so painful it's almost unbearable to consider. She hid for 7 years. She lived in a tiny crawlspace above her grandmother's house. A space so small she couldn't stand upright, barely 3 feet high at its tallest. Scorching in summer, freezing in winter, lying still for months at a time, while her children lived below her, unaware she was there. 7 years in that space, so the man who owned her couldn't reach her. 7 years because the only freedom available to her was a darkness so profound it amounted to a burial before death. When she finally emerged and eventually made her way north, when she finally wrote down what she had witnessed and experienced, she began her account with an apology that speaks volumes about the world she was navigating. She wrote that she knew some would think she was describing things that shouldn't be spoken aloud. She wrote that she wasn't without pride, but she wrote that the truth required telling. And that silence was the only thing the perpetrators of these crimes actually wanted from their victims. She refused to give it to them. Harriet Jacobs was a writer. She was educated in defiance of laws that made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. She possessed both the words and the courage to set down her experience in a form that could reach the public. But the overwhelming majority of women who shared her experience had neither literacy nor platform. Their stories existed only in the architecture of memory, held within them through the decades after emancipation, carried through lives of continued poverty and marginalization until age began its final work. By the 1930s, many of the last living survivors of American slavery were dying. They were elderly, some in their 70s, others in their 80s or 90s. They had been children when the Civil War ended, and they had carried within them for 70 years recollections of a world most of their grandchildren could barely fathom. The Federal Writers Project, a New Deal initiative, sent interviewers across the former Confederate states to capture the testimonies of these men and women before those memories vanished forever. The project eventually collected over 2,000 narratives from formerly enslaved individuals across 17 states. It stands as one of the most remarkable archives in American literary history. It is also one of the most heartbreaking, because reading through those narratives is to understand, in the most direct and unfiltered way possible, what slavery actually was. Not slavery as an abstraction, not slavery as an economic system described in ledgers. Slavery as it was lived, day by day and night by night, by those who had no choice but to endure it. And among the testimonies gathered by the Federal Writers Project, the subject of what happened when guests arrived at the Plantation house appears with a frequency and consistency that can't be dismissed as coincidence or individual anomaly. It appears because it wasn't individual. It was systemic. It was a feature, not a flaw, of how plantation hospitality functioned. An elderly woman from Louisiana, interviewed in the late 1930s, remembered a young housemaid she had known as a child on the plantation where they both lived. She described the girl as quiet, hardworking, careful. She described how the girl had been assigned to the upstairs guest rooms, and how whenever important men stayed overnight at the plantation house, the girl was sent to their rooms in the evening with candles and wine. The woman telling this story was in her late 80s when she spoke. More than 70 years had passed since slavery ended. She remembered the girl's face when she came back from those rooms. She remembered how she sat alone in the servant quarters long after midnight, crying quietly. She remembered how no one spoke of it the next morning. They all went back to their work and pretended nothing had happened. What that testimony captures, with an economy and precision no academic analysis can improve, is the specific moral framework of the plantation world. It was a world where everyone knew. The enslaved people knew. The mistress often knew. The children of the household sometimes knew. The visiting neighbors knew. And the shared communal choice not to speak, not to name, not to acknowledge wasn't innocence. It was the active upkeep of a fiction the entire society needed to function. Another testimony, from a man interviewed in Mississippi, described the gambling nights neighboring plantation owners organized on the estate where he had lived as a child. He had been a boy during slavery, old enough to observe, but not yet old enough to fully comprehend everything he saw. What he remembered most vividly, he said, was the sound of the men drinking late into the night, and the quiet way the housemaids moved through the house, serving food and refilling glasses, and the way those same women looked the next morning when he saw them starting their chores in the kitchen. They never spoke about what had happened during the night, but even as a child, he understood that something had happened, something the world he lived in had decided was normal. Across the rolling countryside of Virginia, where tobacco had built generations of plantation wealth, and the rivers ran wide and slow between banks dense with oak and cypress. The plantation gathering was a cornerstone of white social life. Men who spent their days managing enslaved labor, negotiating crop prices, and maintaining the elaborate machinery of the slave economy needed recreation. They found it in each other's company. The gatherings varied in scale and formality. Some were formal dinners staged with the full theatrical apparatus of white linen tablecloths, silver candlesticks, and elaborate food prepared by enslaved cooks who worked through the afternoon and into the night to produce meals with French names on handwritten menu cards. Others were less formal. A group of neighboring plantation owners arriving on horseback, the horses tied at the post near the front porch, the men bringing their own whiskey and cards and settling in for an evening of gambling that might stretch until 2 or 3 in the morning. What both types of gathering had in common, beneath their surface differences of formality and scale, was the presence of enslaved women moving through the rooms, carrying food and drink, clearing plates, keeping the candles burning, and existing in the minds of the men they served as part of the plantation house's ambient environment. Not people to be acknowledged, but features of the setting, furniture that moved. This perception, this deliberate reduction of human beings to their instrumental functions, wasn't incidental to what happened during these nights. It was prerequisite. It was the mental operation that enabled the orders given after the gambling ended, when the bottles were empty and the men prepared to head to their rooms. To order a person into a room for exploitation requires first convincing yourself, or at least performing the convincing, that what you're ordering isn't a person, but a thing. The language of slavery provided the vocabulary for exactly this performance: a property, servant, girl, never woman. The testimonies from Virginia plantations describe a pattern with a consistency that speaks to how widespread the practice was. A group of men gathering. Drinking that grew heavier as the evening progressed. Card games that generated the particular emotional volatility of gambling. And then, when the games ended, when the money had changed hands, when the men were drunk enough to feel invulnerable and sober enough to still give clear orders, the commands the enslaved women in the house had been dreading since they first heard the carriages rolling up the drive. The orders were never given with anger. Testimony after testimony makes this point, and it's worth sitting with because it reveals something important about the psychology of the men giving them. The orders were delivered calmly, sometimes almost apologetically. The way someone might apologize for a minor inconvenience they're causing another. Send one of the girls to the guest rooms. Make sure the gentlemen are comfortable tonight. The casual register, the domestic vocabulary, the performance of normality. All of it designed to encode the intolerable as routine. For the women who received those orders, there was no confusion about what was being asked. There was no ambiguity to navigate. There was only the calculation of survival. What happens if I refuse? What happens to my children if I refuse? What happens to the woman who shares my quarters, my food, my small daily existence, if my refusal makes the master angry tonight? Slavery operated through precisely these calculations. It didn't require constant violence because the threat of violence, ever present and omnidirectional, did most of the work. The woman who walked slowly down the hallway toward the guest room wasn't submitting to the desire of the man waiting behind that door. She was submitting to the entire weight of a society, built to give her no other viable option. And when she returned before dawn to take up her work again, there was no acknowledgement, no comfort offered by the master or his family, no recognition that anything unusual had occurred. The performance of normality continued into the morning, as if the night hadn't happened, as if she hadn't happened. If the plantation owner represented one layer of the threat enslaved women navigated, the overseer represented another, and in some ways a more immediate one. The plantation owner was the ultimate authority, but he wasn't always present. He might have business in town. He might be traveling. He might spend weeks away from the estate while his crops were tended and his workers managed by the man he had hired to enforce his rule. The overseer was that man. And in the plantation hierarchy, the overseer held a position that was, in some respects, the most psychologically complex of any player in the slave economy. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't own the land or the people working it. He was himself a laborer, hired labor, paid a wage to maintain a system from which he benefited only indirectly. Yet he wielded, within the plantation's borders, near total authority over the lives of dozens or hundreds of human beings. He could punish. He could restrict. He could assign the hardest work in the worst conditions. And he could, if the owner was absent, indifferent, or complicit, extend that authority into domains that had nothing to do with cotton production. The Mississippi testimony collected by the federal writers project from a formerly enslaved cook who had worked on a large cotton plantation describes an overseer whose character embodies everything the concentration of unchecked power does to the men who hold it. He was known for cruelty long before his parties began. He had established his reputation through the particular directness of his punishments in the cotton fields. A kind of theatrical brutality designed to communicate to everyone watching that his authority had no limits and that defying it would bring consequences severe enough to serve as a permanent lesson. But the cruelty of the daytime fields was, in a sense, the public performance of his power. The gatherings he began hosting on weekend evenings were something different. The private expression of it. He invited other overseers from neighboring plantations. He invited traders passing through the region. He invited men whose position in the colonial hierarchy of the plantation world was similar to his own. Men with authority, but without wealth. Men who found in these gatherings a temporary confirmation that their power over others was real and absolute. The enslaved cook who described these nights had watched them unfold many times. She had carried food to the table, where the men drank and shouted stories. She had refilled glasses and cleared plates, while keeping her eyes directed toward the floor, understanding that visibility invited attention, and that attention in the atmosphere of those nights was never safe. She had listened to the progression of the drinking and the progression of the men's behavior, louder and more reckless as the whiskey moved through them, until the inevitable moment when the overseer rose from his chair and issued the instructions every person in the servant quarters had been waiting for with dread. Send the girls. Make sure our guests are satisfied. The cook described one particular young woman who had arrived on the plantation only a few years earlier. Sold from another estate, separated from everyone she knew, navigating a world that had stripped her of every familiar anchor. The older women on the plantation had tried to protect her in the ways available to them. Small ways, meaningful ways, the kind that keep people alive inside situations that might otherwise destroy them entirely. They had placed her close to them in the work rotation. They had warned her about the overseer's parties. They had tried to create a kind of distributed shield around her made of presence and proximity. But the overseer's order couldn't be deflected by presence and proximity. When her name was given one evening, she walked down the hallway with trembling hands, carrying a small tray, and the women in the kitchen heard the door close at the end of the hall. And they waited. They had learned to wait. And when she returned before sunrise, looking the way women returning from those rooms always looked, the cook placed a hand briefly on her arm. There were no words. Words would have been inadequate to the weight of what had happened. There was only the acknowledgement of witness, the confirmation that someone had seen, and that seeing, even in silence, was a form of resistance available to them when no other form was. The plantation record books of that era contain no mention of these events. They record the weight of cotton bales, the number of field hands, the purchase prices of enslaved people, the cost of medical attention and equipment. They do not record what happened in the plantation house when the overseer's guests arrived, because the men keeping those records had decided, as a matter of conscious policy, that these events didn't require recording, that they weren't events at all, that they were simply part of the ambient operation of a system that was, in their understanding, working exactly as designed. Names matter. The names people give to places and things carry within them the concentrated weight of experience that official language has declined to record. In the formal vocabulary of the plantation house, every room had a function and a designation drawn from the architecture of white domestic life. Guest rooms, parlors, drawing rooms, dining rooms, the language of comfort and hospitality. But the enslaved people who moved through those rooms, who cleaned them, tended them, and occupied them under circumstances that bore no relationship to comfort or hospitality, developed their own names for the spaces that mattered most in their lives. And on a plantation located in the low coastal country of South Carolina, where rice paddies spread across the wetlands, and the heavy air carried the smell of river water and marsh grass year-round, the enslaved workers gave one room a name that has endured through the testimonies collected long after slavery ended. They called it the guest room of sorrow. The name wasn't spoken to white people. It passed through the servant quarters in whispers, communicated from older workers to newer arrivals as one of the essential pieces of information required to survive on that particular plantation. It was delivered the way all critical knowledge was delivered in the slave community, through the quiet, precise person-to-person transmission of intelligence that the people at the top of the plantation hierarchy never fully understood was happening, because they had decided the people doing it weren't intelligent enough to be worth understanding. The room itself wasn't distinctive in appearance. A bed, furniture suited to a guest's comfort. A window facing the direction from which visitors arrived, so the approaching carriage could be seen from inside the room. A place where traveling businessmen rested, where neighboring plantation owners stayed during multi-day visits, where doctors, lawyers, and traders slept on their journeys through the region. A room like many others in many houses across the South, which is precisely the point. What made it the room of sorrow wasn't its physical characteristics. What made it the room of sorrow was the pattern of what happened in it. An elderly man who had grown up on that plantation, interviewed by the Federal Writers Project when he was in his 80s, described the routine with a specificity that suggests the pattern had been established so firmly, repeated so reliably, that every person on the plantation knew it, as well as they knew the rhythm of the workday. When visitors arrived, the household was mobilized. Rooms were prepared, food was cooked, the formal machinery of plantation hospitality was activated. After dinner, when the conversation between the plantation owner and his guests had concluded, and the whiskey bottles were brought out, the evening moved into its later phase. The house grew quieter. Servants finished their work in the kitchen and the dining room. The last plates were cleared, the last glasses refilled. And then, in the voice of the plantation owner, came the instructions that transformed the guest room of sorrow from a room into a sentence. One of the girls would be chosen. The choice varied. The man explained. Sometimes it was based on who the visiting guest had looked at during dinner. Sometimes it seemed to have no logic the enslaved people could identify. But the result was always the same. A young woman carrying a candle, walking the length of the hallway toward the room, at the front of the house, the door closing behind her. The rest of the house settling into the performance of sleep. The elderly man described watching this process as a boy. He said he couldn't at first understand the full weight of what he was seeing. He saw the women walk to the room. He saw them return in the morning. He saw the expression on their faces, or more precisely, the deliberate absence of expression. The practiced blankness enslaved people learned to maintain over anything they needed to protect. He said he eventually understood as he grew older that the blankness wasn't absence of feeling. It was the membrane between interior reality and the hostile exterior world. It was the face that said nothing while the person behind it continued to exist, continued to feel, continued to carry the full weight of what had been done to them by a system that counted their silence as their consent. One woman who had herself been a housemaid on that plantation described something the man's testimony didn't capture. She described what the older servants told the younger ones when they first arrived. The quiet transmission of knowledge that was both warning and preparation, and an inadequate substitute for the protection that should have existed and didn't. Stay close to the kitchen. Keep your head down when the visitors come. Don't catch anyone's eye at dinner. Move quickly through the hallways and don't linger. None of it was enough. She knew that now, she said, speaking from the distance of decades. None of the warnings, strategies, or small acts of navigation the older women shared with the younger ones were enough to protect them from the fundamental reality of their position. What those strategies could do, and what they did do, was communicate something essential: you are not alone. We see what is happening to you. We can't stop it. But we are here, and when you return, we will still be here. And that's what we have to offer in a world that has taken everything else. There's a particular cruelty embedded in how the plantation economy used the physical appearance of enslaved women, and it requires careful examination because it reveals something about the specific mechanics of exploitation that the more general narrative of slavery sometimes obscures. In the cotton fields of Georgia and the surrounding states, physical labor was the primary currency of exploitation. An enslaved person's value was measured in their capacity for sustained agricultural work. In the weight of cotton they could pick, in the acres they could prepare, in the hours of labor that could be extracted from their bodies before those bodies gave out. In this calculus, appearance was irrelevant. What mattered was endurance. But inside the plantation house, a different calculus operated. And within that different calculus, the physical appearance of enslaved women became a form of vulnerability that added another dimension of danger to their already dangerous position. To be considered attractive in the eyes of the plantation owner and his guests wasn't an advantage. It was an exposure. It meant being more frequently selected. It meant being placed in closer proximity to the men who visited the house. It meant being watched with an attention that wasn't admiring but predatory, not flattering but threatening. The woman who shared the testimony recorded in the Federal Writers Project from Georgia had been sold at auction as a young girl, separated from her mother in the transaction that most enslaved people identified as the single, most traumatic event of their lives. She remembered the auction yard with the particular vividness, extreme fear imprints on memory. The crowd of buyers moving among the people lined up for inspection. The hands that examined bodies for signs of strength or illness. The moment her mother was sold to a buyer moving in a different direction. And the impossibility of that separation. The way it unmade the only stable structure her childhood had contained. She was purchased by a plantation owner who brought her to his estate and assigned her to the house rather than the fields. She understood when this happened that she was receiving something other young women on the plantation hadn't received. She didn't yet understand what the assignment would cost her. The pattern revealed itself gradually. The visits from neighboring planters, the dinners, the way certain men watched her as she moved through the room serving food. The instruction from the plantation owner, delivered one evening in the quiet hallway, with the same casual authority that characterized all such instructions. That she should bring candles to the guest room and make sure the visitor was comfortable through the night. She described the walk down the hallway with a specificity that suggests she had replayed it in her memory many times over the following years. The sound of her own footsteps on the wooden floor, the flickering of the candle she carried, the voices behind her in the dining room, growing fainter as she approached the door, the knock, the entry, the closing of the door behind her. What she endured in that room, and in the many rooms that followed over the years of her service in the plantation house, she described only obliquely in her testimony. This obliqueness was common in the federal writers' project narratives, not because the interviewees were confused about what had happened to them, but because the interviewers were white, often Southern, and the women being interviewed had spent their entire lives learning to calibrate how much truth was safe to deliver to which audience. They gave what they could give. They protected what needed protecting. What she described directly was the consequence. The pregnancy that came and the plantation owner's decision to sell her again, this time at another auction in a nearby town. She described standing in that auction yard for the second time in her life, older but no less terrified, carrying inside her body the evidence of what had been done to her, waiting to discover which direction her life would be forced to take next. She was purchased again, taken to another plantation. The specifics of what followed are fragmented in the record, but what survives in her testimony is something more durable than specific details. It's the account of what it cost to be a black woman in the Antebellum South. Not just the physical cost, though that was enormous, but the cost to the interior life, the cost to the self, the sustained effort required to remain in some meaningful sense a person inside a system that had decided you weren't one. There's a specific quality of dread reserved for the anticipated return of harm. It's different from the fear of a threat that's unknown or unpredictable. It's worse in some respects because it carries the full weight of previous experience behind it. Because the body already knows what's coming and has no mechanism for avoiding the knowledge. It's the dread that accumulates in the period between the recognition of the threat and the moment of its arrival. The time when you can see the carriage coming down the road, and you can't look away, and you can't run, and all you can do is stand in the kitchen doorway and watch it come. On a large cotton plantation in Alabama, this particular quality of dread was attached to one specific carriage. The dark wheels, the two horses, the distinctive silhouette that became visible along the main road as it approached the estate from the direction of the county seat. The doctor's carriage. Doctors in the Antebellum South held a position in the plantation world that was economically and socially complex. They were professionals in an era when professional status carried considerable social weight. They were respected guests at the plantation houses they visited, offered the hospitality of the dining room and the guest room as a matter of social protocol. And they moved through the plantation economy with a freedom of motion most people in that world didn't possess. They traveled between estates, staying overnight when the distance was too great for a single day's journey, accepted into the domestic interior of the plantation house as a trusted figure whose presence was always welcome. What that trusted status meant in practice for the enslaved women working inside those houses was another form of the exposure every aspect of the plantation world seemed designed to maximize. The testimony from the Alabama plantation, preserved through the Federal Writers Project, came from an older woman who had worked as a cook on the estate for many years. She described the pattern of the doctor's visits with the precision of someone who had watched it unfold so many times that its sequence had become as familiar as the rhythm of the seasons. The carriage appearing on the road in the late afternoon, the word spreading quickly through the plantation, as words always spread in the communities of the enslaved, who had developed systems of communication so efficient and so invisible to the white household that information traveled through those networks faster than most people running it could have managed. The doctor's coming. For most of the plantation, this announcement meant a routine disruption. The household would be activated to receive a guest. Rooms prepared, food cooked, the formal protocols of plantation hospitality enacted. But for one young maid working inside the house, the announcement meant something entirely different. The cook described watching the girl's face change when she heard the news. The shoulders that dropped slightly, as if a weight had settled onto them, the hands that became less steady in their work. The cook knew what the visits meant for the girl. She had seen the pattern establish itself from the first time the doctor had stayed overnight at the plantation, and the owner had sent the maid to attend him in the guest room. She had seen the maid return in the morning with the expression all these women learned to wear. The face that communicated nothing, while the person behind it processed everything. She had placed her hand on the girl's arm in the morning. The gesture of witness that was the most the cook could offer within the constraints of the world they shared. The visits continued. They became, as patterns in the plantation world tended to become, regular and expected. The doctor arrived. He was given dinner and whiskey and conversation. Late in the evening, the owner gave the instruction: send the girl. And in the morning, the girl returned. What the cook described most powerfully wasn't any single night, but the accumulation of nights. The way the knowledge that the doctor would return sat inside the maid between his visits. The way the sight of his carriage, on the road visible from the kitchen window, produced a physical response. The cook could observe from across the room, without the girl saying a word. The way the certainty of what was coming was in some respects worse than the event itself, because at least during the event, there was no time left for anticipation. She said that after slavery ended, and she had moved to a new life in another community, she sometimes thought about the girl and wondered what had become of her. She didn't know. The records didn't know. The Federal Writers Project didn't find her. She had passed into the silence that absorbed most of the people who moved through the plantation houses of the Antebellum South. Their experience real, their suffering real, their existence real, but their names and their stories erased by a world that had decided their documentation wasn't worth preserving. The rivers of the American South were the arteries of the antebellum economy. Before the railroads arrived, before roads were improved enough to carry heavy freight reliably, the rivers did the work. The Mississippi, the Alabama, the Arkansas, the Savannah, the James. These waterways moved cotton from plantations to markets, carried goods from urban centers into the rural interior, and provided the primary routes of travel for the men who conducted the commercial business of the slave economy. River traders were among the most mobile figures in this world. They traveled constantly, their boats loaded with goods of all kinds, stopping at plantations along the banks to conduct transactions that might take an afternoon or an entire day. When the distance between stops was too great for a single day's travel, they required overnight accommodation. The plantations that sat near the river provided it. A guest house near the bank or a room inside the main house was a standard feature of any plantation that did business along the water routes. And the men who ran those plantations understood something about hospitality that had nothing to do with genuine generosity, and everything to do with the commercial relationships their economic survival depended on. A trader who was made comfortable during his overnight stay was a trader more likely to return. A trader who was offered not just a room and a meal, but the full range of the plantation's resources was a trader who left with a favorable impression of his host. And in the world of the antebellum South, the full range of the plantation's resources included its enslaved population. The testimony from the Arkansas River Plantation is in some respects the most clinical of all the accounts that have survived. And that clinical quality makes it paradoxically among the most disturbing. The cook who described these events spoke about them with the matter of fact clarity of someone who had processed what she witnessed over 70 years and arrived at a place beyond outrage. A place of simply knowing what was true and determining to say it plainly. Boats would arrive along the riverbank in the late afternoon. The traders would come to the house to conduct their business with the owner. After the transactions were complete, he would invite them to stay for dinner and remain overnight. The cook would prepare the meal. The servants would clear the table and refill the glasses. And when the dinner ended and the traders prepared to move to the guest house near the water, the owner would turn to the house servants and deliver the instructions she had heard so many times. Send 2 of the girls to the guest house. Make sure the traders are comfortable tonight. 2, not 1, 2. The addition of that number communicates something about the scale and the normality of the practice. This wasn't an occasional event born of unusual circumstances. It was a routine offering. It was hospitality. It was part of how this plantation conducted its business relationships with the men who traveled the river and needed a place to stop. The cook described watching the 2 young women walk down the path toward the guest house carrying small lanterns. The path went through tall grass and trees before reaching the water. From the plantation yard, their lanterns were visible as small points of moving light in the darkness, growing smaller as they moved away from the house until they reached the guest house door and disappeared inside. She described sitting awake in the servant quarters that night, as she often did when this happened, listening to the river. The sound of water against the banks, the distant creak of the boats tied along the shore, the sound of the men's voices inside the guest house carrying faintly across the water, then eventually going quiet. The long silence of the night. And then, when the sky began to lighten before dawn, the 2 small lanterns moving back along the path toward the plantation house, growing larger as they approached, until the two women stepped back into the yard and began preparing for another day of work. No one asked what had happened. No one acknowledged that anything had happened. The traders had their breakfast, conducted any remaining business, and departed down the river. The plantation continued its operations. The cook continued her work, and the two women who had walked down to the guest house the previous night continued theirs. The cook said she had thought for many years about whether she should have done something different, whether there was a choice available to her that she hadn't seen at the time. She always arrived at the same answer. There was no choice available that didn't carry a cost greater than the one they were already paying. The plantation owner had total authority. The law provided no recourse. The social world surrounding them offered no ally. The best that could be done, and she had done it, was to be present, to wait awake, to be there when they returned, to let them know, through that act of waiting, that they hadn't been forgotten. History, and particularly the history of oppression, has a tendency to record the dramatic forms of resistance and to overlook or render invisible the forms that operated below the threshold of the dramatic. It records the revolts. It records the runaways who reached the north. It records the instances where enslaved people struck back with visible, legible force. What it records far less reliably is the resistance that happened in whispers. The resistance of presence, the resistance of witness, the resistance of survival. And yet within the testimony of the women and men who described what happened inside the plantation houses when guests arrived, the evidence of this quieter resistance appears everywhere. Not as heroism in the Hollywood sense of the word, but as something more human and more honesty, as the effort to preserve, under conditions designed to make preservation impossible, the interior life that slavery could surveil and punish, but couldn't fully enter. The older women who warned the younger ones. The cooks who stayed awake waiting for the women to return from the guest rooms. The friends who sat beside each other in silence in the servant quarters, offering the company of another human being as the only comfort available. The whispered names they gave to the places of danger. The guest room of sorrow spoken quietly, passed from one person to the next, carrying within those 4 words the entire weight of what had happened there. The insistence on naming what the official vocabulary refused to acknowledge. Harriet Jacobs, whose resistance was perhaps the most documented and the most dramatic, described a form of resistance she chose because it was the only one available to her that might actually work. She created a situation that removed her from her enslaver's reach by removing herself entirely from the world. The crawl space above her grandmother's house. 7 years of that darkness, chosen over the alternative. That choice, made in full knowledge of its costs, was an act of resistance. It was also an act of resistance to the narrative slavery's supporters constructed about enslaved people. The narrative that claimed they were passive, accepting, incapable of the kind of sustained strategic thinking and fierce self-determination Jacob's 7 years in that crawl space represents. Other women found other forms. Some formed relationships with other enslaved men that provided a measure of protection through the plantation owner's calculation that disrupting those relationships would cause more inconvenience than it was worth. Some sought favor from the mistress of the house, creating a proximity that functioned as an imperfect shield against the worst of what the master might otherwise arrange. Some pretended illness when guests arrived. Some became indispensable to the domestic operations of the household in ways that made their absence from their assigned duties conspicuous enough to reduce the frequency with which they were chosen. None of these strategies was fully effective. None of them removed the danger. All of them represent the exercise of intelligence and agency in a situation designed to eliminate both. The women who deployed them weren't passive. They were navigating an impossible terrain with whatever tools were available to them. And they were doing so with a sophistication and tenacity, the official history of slavery, with its focus on the dramatic and the visible, has chronically underrecognized. The testimonies collected by the federal writers project preserve these strategies in fragments. In the cook who placed her hand on the girl's arm, in the older woman who warned the new arrival to stay near the kitchen, in the women who waited awake, in the quiet community of witness that formed itself around the suffering of the most vulnerable, offering what it could offer, which wasn't protection but was presence, which is not nothing. In a world that had decided these women didn't matter, the insistence of the people around them that they did was itself a form of resistance. Small, insufficient, essential. When we ask why the history we've been exploring tonight was buried for so long, why it appeared so rarely in official accounts of plantation life, why it required the courage of Harriet Jacobs and the elderly testimonies of formerly enslaved people collected by the Federal Writers Project to enter the historical record at all. We are asking a question and has a precise and unsatisfying answer. It was buried because the people who controlled the production of history didn't want it found. The Antebellum South constructed a narrative about itself that required as its foundation the denial of the full humanity of the people it enslaved. This wasn't accidental. It was a philosophical and legal necessity. A society that enslaves human beings for profit can only sustain that practice if it's able to maintain the fiction that the beings it enslaves aren't fully human, that they don't feel what other human beings feel, that their suffering isn't the same suffering other human beings recognize as suffering, that their interior lives aren't in any meaningful sense interior lives. This fiction required constant maintenance. Every act of enslaved resistance, every testimony of enslaved intelligence and dignity and feeling, every documented instance of enslaved people loving their children, protecting each other, building communities and cultures and spiritual lives within the constraints of their bondage, was a threat to the fiction. And threats to the fiction were managed in the most direct way available. They were suppressed. Stories weren't told. Documents weren't preserved. Testimonies weren't recorded. And when they were recorded, as in the case of Harriet Jacobs, they were dismissed, doubted, challenged, their author's credibility attacked. The specific suppression of the history of sexual exploitation within the plantation household served an additional function beyond the general denial of enslaved humanity. It protected the reputations, the marriages, the social standing, and the legal interests of the specific men who had participated in that exploitation. Many of those men had white families dependent on those reputations. Many had political careers, business interests, and social positions the truth of their behavior would have jeopardized. And many of them were still alive and still powerful long after slavery ended. In a society that had decided through the failures of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow that the full reckoning with what had happened wouldn't occur. The silence wasn't passive, it was enforced. The women who had survived these experiences found themselves after emancipation in a world that offered them freedom in name, but continued to surround them with the social and economic power of the men who had exploited them, and the families and institutions that had benefited from that exploitation. Speaking the truth in that world carried consequences. The silence was maintained not by the women who had experienced these events, but by the structures that made speaking dangerous. And so the testimonies waited. They waited in the memories of elderly women and men who had been children during slavery. They waited until the 1930s, when interviewers from the Federal Writers Project traveled across the South and sat down with people in their 80s and 90s who finally had the opportunity, at the end of their lives, to say what they had witnessed. By then, many of the people most directly affected were gone. The women themselves, the ones who had walked those hallways, who had returned before dawn to begin another day of work. Most of them had lived their entire lives without the world ever acknowledging what had been done to them. What remains is what they chose to leave: the testimonies, the memoirs, the whispered names that passed through the slave quarters and eventually passed through history. The guest room of sorrow, the sound of carriage wheels on a dirt road, the small lanterns moving through the grass toward the river. There's a question that must be asked at the end of a story like this one, and it deserves a more honest answer than the comfortable ones sometimes offered in its place. The question is this: what do we owe to the people whose stories we've just heard? The easy answer, the one that allows the audience to leave with their conscience satisfied, is that we owe them remembrance. That by listening to these stories, by bearing witness to what happened in those plantation houses, we've fulfilled some obligation to the dead, that the act of knowing is itself sufficient tribute. But the harder answer, the one these women's testimonies actually demand, if we're reading them with the attention they deserve, is that remembrance isn't enough. It's the beginning of an obligation, not the end of one. The history we've explored tonight didn't end when slavery ended. The specific exploitation of black women's bodies within the plantation system was a practice embedded in a broader set of social, legal, and economic arrangements. Those arrangements didn't disappear with emancipation. They transformed. The legal protections that were supposed to replace slavery's total denial of personhood were undermined systematically through the decades that followed Reconstruction. The economic conditions that maintained black women's vulnerability to exploitation were reconstituted through Jim Crow, through sharecropping systems that reproduced many of the dynamics of plantation labor, through the deliberate exclusion of black workers from the labor protections and social insurance programs the New Deal constructed for the rest of the working population. The women who finally spoke to Federal Writers Project interviewers in the 1930s were speaking from a world that hadn't, in the ways that mattered most to their daily lives, actually changed as much as the official narrative of American progress claimed. They were speaking from poverty, mostly from communities still shaped by the long shadow of the system that had produced their memories, from lives in which freedom was real, but its material conditions were constrained by exactly the same concentrations of power that had constrained their grandmothers. To remember them, in the fullest sense of that word, requires more than knowing their stories. It requires taking seriously the questions their stories raise about how power operates, about who is protected and who is exposed by the systems we inhabit, about what it means when the most vulnerable people in a society are asked to absorb the costs of its worst impulses in silence, and then denied even the acknowledgement of what they've absorbed. The women who walked those hallways don't need our pity. They weren't pitiful. They were extraordinary in the specific and demanding sense that they survived, with their interior lives and their human dignity intact, conditions designed to destroy both. What they deserve from us isn't the softening comfort of pity, but the harder, more demanding gift of genuine understanding. Understanding that what was done to them was wrong. understanding who did it and who benefited, understanding that the silence that surrounded it wasn't a natural silence, but a manufactured one, maintained by the deliberate choices of people with power, and understanding that manufactured silences can be unmade, that the voices buried beneath them can be recovered, and that the recovery of those voices isn't a sentimental act, but a political one. That's what we do on Shadows of Black History. We unmake the manufactured silence. We recover the voices. We name the rooms that carried names no official document preserved. We listen to the sound of carriage wheels on a dirt road, and we refuse to pretend we don't know what it means. The women of the plantation houses lived in a world that tried to erase them. They endured that world, most of them, without the luxury of leaving any record behind. The records that exist, we've explored together tonight, and they're enough to know that these women were here, that they thought and felt and suffered and resisted and endured, that they cared for each other in the small ways that were all that were available to them, that they waited awake through long nights for the women who had been sent to the guest rooms, that they placed their hands on each other's arms in the morning. That isn't nothing. That's everything. And the least we can do from the distance of 3 centuries and the relative safety of our own lives is to hear them. You've just heard the voices that the official history of America worked for 200 years to keep silent. The women of the plantation houses, the cooks and the maids and the young girls who carried candles down hallways they didn't want to enter. The women who waited awake. The women who placed their hands on each other's arms. The women who named the rooms that official documents refused to name. Their stories aren't comfortable. They were never meant to be comfortable. They're meant to be true. And on Shadows of Black History, truth is the only thing we're interested in. If this story reached you tonight, if it opened something in you, if it gave you a name or a face for a part of history that had previously been only abstraction, then do something with that. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not just people who already know this history. People who don't. People who were taught a version of the Antebellum South, in which the plantation house was a place of elegance and order, and nothing more complicated than that. Show them what the elegance was built on. Leave a comment below. Tell us which part of the story stayed with you. Tell us what questions it raised for you. Tell us where you are in the world tonight. We read every comment. We see every person in this community from across this globe, and every single one of you choosing to spend your time with these forgotten voices is an act of witness that matters. Subscribe to Shadows of Black History. Turn on your notifications, because we aren't finished. The archive of buried Black history is vast, and we're only at its edges. There are more names, more rooms, more testimonies waiting to be heard by an audience willing to listen without looking away. Until our next story, remember this: the most powerful thing a witness can do is refuse to pretend they didn't see. These women showed us what they endured. The least we can do is see it clearly. We'll keep bringing you the stories they never wanted you to know.